Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 4 of Introduction to Corrections. And this week, we're going to be looking at the correction system. Uh, so, hang on, let me get this darn thing started. Okay, so similar to what we've done in other units, this unit will take a look at corrections. For those of you that are continuing on in criminology, we'll have a course that does nothing more than covers corrections. For those of you taking this as an elective, it should give you enough background after this lecture and the readings we've had this week to take a look and to be much more versed in the topic. All right. With that being said, let me tell you about our correction system. First of all, I want to give you some terms, all right? And these terms, jail and prison, are terms that are many times mixed up. Jails are operated at a county level, all right? And jails are used for people that have been convicted of misdemeanors or short felony sentences, as well as individuals who are awaiting trial that have either do not have bail, have not had bail set, or have not made bail. As a result, jails can be a very difficult place to run because people are going in and out based on when they make bail. But more importantly, you have offenders of many different levels that are staying in the same facility. It's very possible at any given time a jail may have somebody convicted of a DUI that'll be out in 24 hours, um, as well as somebody that's been convicted of capital murder. So the challenge of running the place is obviously you don't want to have the DUI gentleman be a cellmate of the person that's convicted of capital murder. The challenge of running a jail is to create the challenge of running the jail is to create an environment where all individuals are safe and are able to complete the task as mandated by the criminal justice system. Prisons are normally operated by the state as well as the federal government. And they are normally for felons. And these are people that are convicted of more severe acts. Now, in certain small states, such as Connecticut and Rhode Island, there is no distinction between jails and prisons. All corrections are run at the state level, just because it doesn't work efficiently at the county level. But by and large, once you start to get to bigger states, prisons will be institutions that are run by the state. Now, prisons can sometimes be safer, sometimes be more dangerous. Prisons are housing more harsh offenders for longer periods of time, so that there is a possibility. There's a greater possibility of incident, particularly for individuals that have a tendency of violence. However, there's a safety valve there as well, in that most people that are housed in the facility are of the same risk. And what I mean by that is they're classified by their offense level, and you have maximum security, medium security, minimum security, and a few things beyond that. But they're folks that meet the qualifications of each of those levels. As a result, those working in those facilities are used to working with people that are of that level. Finally, in the correction systems as well is something that's known as community corrections. That includes probation and parole. Parole, by the way, is an early release from prison that comes with conditions. Probation is normally some form of alternate sentence. So try not to get those mixed up. Parole frequently is run by the state. Probation is frequently run by the county. But in the state of Arkansas, you have people that are combined to do both. Lastly, under community corrections are various diversion programs that are designed to divert people out of the criminal justice system. An example of a diversion that we talked about earlier were specialized courts. Or there are examples as well of people wearing ankle monitors or in some form of house arrest. Okay. Now, by and large, many people are concerned about corrections in the United States. Many people will charge that it's gotten out of control. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. Approximately 750 people per 100,000 are incarcerated. Now, as we get into another unit, you'll actually see how, in our social justice unit, how those numbers boil down. But for now, I want to point out that our incarceration rate is the highest in the world. About 10 years ago, we beat Russia, that sits as number 2 at about 550 per 100,000, and we're also significantly higher than China. In comparison, countries in Western Europe tend to have incarceration rates of approximately anywhere from 75 to 100 per 100,000. So our incarceration rate is approximately 7 times the Western world. Why are we so high? That's a really good question, and something that corrections looks at very much. However, um, and this is a question that has many answers. Are Americans more criminally inclined than their peers across the rest of the world? Or are we just more bureaucratic and law enforcement like, so that we tend to enforce acts and want to deal with it formally as opposed to informal solutions, which can occur in many other countries? Um, Lastly, I want to point out that incarcerations are very expensive. Um, and this is something that many people don't really think about. But keep in mind, you're running a facility for 24 hours a day. That means you have to staff 3 shifts worth of individuals to keep a facility safe. This gets expensive, all right? As well as you have other items like medical care, utilities, uh, all things that are expensive because you have to keep in mind inmates are not able to pay for this stuff themselves. So it creates a dynamic where we spend a lot of money to incarcerate a lot of people, and that's something that people question. Now, something that's even more important for us to question is the fact that states often take money from higher education um, to fund corrections. Actually, there have been studies done that have examined uh, as correction spending goes up, higher education spending by the state goes down. And the reason for that is that states have that higher education has an additional source of revenue, and that source of revenue is tuition. And so we see that tuition has for the last 2 or 3 decades outpaced the rate of inflation. Many charges that's because states have shifted money that they normally would have put into higher education and put it into corrections. Just something to think about. Is it worth another $10 a tuition hour to make sure that somebody's incarcerated for a drug offense? Just something to think about. Okay, by and large, um, everyone that is involved with this system, as the numbers seem to indicate above that we talked about last slide, is that this system is broken. I put up the notion last time, are Americans just more criminally inclined? No, they're not. Surveys show that across Europe, across the United States, the easiest thing to measure are use of illicit drugs. Use of illicit drugs are the same across basically all races and all classes, except people that are rich tend to use drugs and alcohol a bit more than everybody else. Uh, so how did we end up with this? How did we end up spending so much money to incarcerate so many people? A lot of that has to deal with politics. One thing that has united the left and the right, and actually is bipartisan, is that there is a notion of being tough on crime. Nobody wants to be seen as light on crime. And by and large, our corrections policy and our criminal justice policy is governed by exceptions. If something incredibly heinous happens, all right, we tend to use that as a reason to increase penalties for everyone. This has become more so since the war on drugs. And I want to use an example on this from my home state of Connecticut. About 7 to 10 years ago, there was a terrible murder in Cheshire, Connecticut. 2 gentlemen that were on parole at a halfway house went to a home and brutally killed a family. Thing was just ugly, 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 ugly. It made news across the state. Now, what the news didn't point out is that these 2 people on parole had committed a terrible murder. But prior to that time, since the parole release on halfway house program had been in place, approximately 10,000 individuals had been released without incident. Now that plays an important role. What the state ended up doing was significantly increasing the requirements for parole so that approximately a quarter of the people that previously had been able to get out could still qualify for parole. The question is if this is one incident in 10,000, do these other 75% of the people at that point that didn't qualify parole, were they somebody that we need to incarcerate and keep in prison? Also, as we have gotten tougher on crime and we haven't wanted to spend money on corrections and incarceration, is we see that many, both jails and prisons, have eliminated programs for rehabilitation. It used to be, for example, there were college courses available. It used to be that there were vocational programs available that could help people get skills that they could use on the outside. By and large, the only programs that we see currently meeting in many facilities are just general education, are GE, not GE, high school diploma classes. Um, and while that's better than not having a diploma, by and large, one of the reasons many of you are in college is the fact that you need a college degree to really make a living wage. And that creates a cycle um, that perpetuates itself that we're going to talk a little bit more about when we deal with reentry. What do you know? It happens to be the next slide. Because of all of the problems we have with corrections, another area that we tend to look at a great deal is something called reentry. And reentry is what happens when somebody leaves a jail or a prison. First of all, 95% of all people that are incarcerated will leave that facility and come back into the community. All right? Um, by and large, we don't do much anymore to prepare inmates for release. All right? And as a result, approximately 2/3 of individuals that have been released will have been reincarcerated within 3 years' time. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, one of the most dangerous periods upon release is when somebody gets out. I've actually done some studies with some local jails in this area and found that what can be very dangerous is when someone is released from either a jail or a prison, rather than starting, first of all, when they're released, they vow that they're never going to come back again, ever, ever, ever. But there's a very short period of time, normally it can be as short as 10 to 20 minutes, before people decide, you know what, I'm out, I want to celebrate. And then what do people do? They go back to the same people, places, and things that they were working with before. Now, there's also an economic quotient there, because people need to find a place to live if they're going to ignore the people, places, and things that got them into trouble before. So we create a cycle that's set up for people to fail. Let me go into this a bit more. Again, we find that by and large, sobriety that may have been hard fought to win inside a jail or a prison is frequently lost within a day or two of release, because the first thing people want to do when they get out is celebrate. So that starts a cycle of addiction potentially all over again. That doesn't occur. There's a number of other obstacles that people have to face. First of all, people that have criminal records have a much harder time finding living wage employment than people that don't. All right? If I have a choice of hiring somebody with a criminal record or hiring someone without a criminal record, approximately 8 times out of 10, I'm going to favor that person without the criminal record. Now, there's been some movement in this area with something called Ban the Box, which creates a system so that people with criminal records aren't automatically screened out of interviews, and they don't ask questions about criminal records until farther along in the employment process. Other issues, housing. Many individuals that are in the system are poor and need to rely on public financing such as Section 8 or public housing to be able to get by. However, in many counties, Craighead County, which is where I'm based, included, all right, felons are not allowed to get into public housing. So a felon that doesn't have a job needs to find a landlord that's not involving public housing, that's going to rent them a house with a criminal record and without a job. That becomes a very hard task. Other issues as well that we explore much more in the corrections course are issues of health care, particularly individuals with mental health problems, so that they can get the medication they need. Another issue that's talked about much more in the corrections class are issues of family ties. Families can be very supportive, but they can also be very destructive. Something else that comes under the issue of family ties is, in many states, Arkansas included, that being incarcerated is not considered a valid excuse to not pay child support. So the moment that an offender comes out and starts working, paychecks are garnished, which inhibits their ability to pay for housing and health care. And many times offenders find themselves supplementing this garnishment with income from illegal activities that gets them back into the system again. Another issue that we look at a great deal is the disproportionate impact of corrections, and this becomes an issue of social justice. One of the big issues that those that are concerned about these issues point out is that African Americans are represented at 4 times their rate in the population. And yes, I've got a typo on the slide. It's my only one in this unit. That there should be THEIR. I'm sorry. But it should be 4 times their rate in the population. All right? 4 times their rate in the population. As question is why? And by the way, African Americans don't make up the majority of those incarcerated, but African Americans make up approximately 12% of the population, and they make up 48% of the population's incarcerated. Which brings issues of race and class. Remember in a previous lecture, we talked about attorneys. Another thing as well, and the question is do we have a racist system? Social justice that we'll talk about in a future unit will say, yeah, there is racism in the system. But there's also a high correlation between African American and being poor. So the question is how much of this is race? How much of this is class? Because at the bottom of this, African Americans are not 4 times more likely to be criminally inclined than their Caucasian peers. Anything that would suggest that, actually, many say is racism. Actually, I'll say that is racism. However, we do have class elements in here. For example, bail systems favor those with money. Also, there's a bias towards those with resources. Again, let's look at the attorneys that we talked about in a previous lecture. So many of those that are critical of the system claim that we have 2 different systems of justice. And the question is that fair? Now, other issues that we take a look at incarceration, one of which you'll take a look at as part of this week's research exercise, are issues of overcrowding. By and large, because we're spending a lot of money right now on corrections, we don't want to spend more. So what we've done in cases is take facilities and house many more individuals than they were designed for. Also, as we are creating longer sentences, we have older inmates, and those inmates are starting to have more expensive healthcare needs. So the question is how that increases the cost of money. Or let's put it this way. I'm currently, as I record this, 52 years old. I can tell you that my healthcare costs are 2 or 3 times what it was when I was 20, even accounting for inflation. All right? So the same dynamic occurs particularly among a population, especially those with addiction, that aren't noted for keeping themselves in good health. Other issues that we need to take a look at is currently we have an opiate crisis, and that opiate crisis is characterized by a lack of treatment, a lack of available treatment, particularly for those that lack insurance. Or put another way, there's always a bed available at the county jail, but there's not always a bed available at the county treatment center. And until that dynamic changes, we're probably going to be seeing more and more people with addiction problems going through the criminal justice system. Not that this number is low right now. When I do my research, I find that approximately, whether they're charged with something or not, is that about 80% of the individuals that we talk to have issues with drugs, alcohol, or mental health. Last but not least, we're also seeing cuts in rehabilitation programming, making the cycle of reentry something that's much more of an issue that we need to contend with. With that, I want to thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found this informative. We will be looking at criminological theory next week. Have a great week. Take care.